Okay, there is our cue to get started. So welcome to the IDRPP's Early Intervention Echo. We're thrilled to finalize and finish up this year's series today. As you notice, we are recording today's session. It is on our Canvas page. You can share that YouTube with anybody that you would like to get them to know what is going on during these sessions. Again, Echo is an interactive community, so if you are willing to turn on your camera, let's see who's on our call so we can get to know each other through this virtual world. It's always a challenge to sometimes do that virtually, but it is a way to just connect with each other. We sometimes talk about individuals on this call, families that we work with, clients that we serve. So please be sure to de-identify any information. If you have any questions about what you should be sharing and what you should not be sharing, you can always reach out to a hub member. They have an asterisk in front of their name and they would be able to answer any questions that you have. Key components of an echo session are we will always have a presenter, someone talking to us about a specific topic. Today we will be finishing up our hearing loss series that we've been doing. And then the other part is a case presentation. And so we have a participant that wants to present a case or talk about a case that they are either having some success with or struggling with and want all of your guys' amazing recommendations and discussions about it. And that's really how we then connect with each other, is talking about what's going on, how we work with certain families. We learn from each other when we have those discussions. And again, that's where we build up that professional networking. Renaming your profile, it's always a way to get to know each other. So I just saw Janelle Boyer come across my screen. She must have been moved around, but I can always say it's Janelle who spells her name the same way that I do. And that doesn't always happen. So again, it just is, and now she's moved again. So she went, I don't want you to call out on me, Janelle. But it just is a way to know where you're from. I know that she's from the Southeast Part C Early Intervention Program. And so she always shares amazing things. And I know that then I can reach out to her and ask any follow-up questions. You can either raise your hand or put your questions into the chat, and we will make sure that those get answered or get monitored. And so you can raise your hand, I'll call on you. If not, put those questions into chat and I'll make sure that they get read and answered. In order to get a credit of attendance or a certificate, we do ask that you complete the survey. The survey is what we then take back to our funding agency to say, here's the impressive work that happens because of these echo sessions and how we keep these sessions for free. So please take a minute. It will be dropped in throughout today's session to complete that survey. And then once a month, we mail out those certificate of attendance. Canvas is where we store everything. So if you want access to our Canvas page, please just email earlyecho@usu.edu and we will get you access to the Canvas page. Case studies are a great way to learn and get amazing resources from everybody on this call. If you are interested in submitting a case, please just reach out to us. You can reach out to me personally or through our early echo at aggies.usu.edu. and we will get you started on a case study. It's a great way to get more information and how to support those families that we work with. Sometimes it's also just oh, I'm doing that. That's right. I am doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So it's kind of that validation too. Next, we do have social media. So if you've not taken a minute to follow us on social media, we're on there. And then a slide is missing. I thought I unhid it, but we are doing registration for our 2025 series. It is open. Can everybody believe that it's already December? In just a few short minutes, it's going to be 2025. And we will be starting that series again. The series won't be starting until February because January starts on a Wednesday, and that's January 1st, and that's usually when we do these sessions, but I don't think that anybody wants to join on a holiday. So we'll be starting in February. I am going to stop sharing and turn the time over to Shelby. She is from North Dakota, and she's going to be wrapping up our hearing loss series.
Okie dokie. All right. Are we all looking at the right screen?
Yes, we are.
We practiced, but I want to make sure.
It
Okay.
looks good.
Perfect. And I can kind of see the chat, but I don't know, Janelle, if you want to just kind of monitor for me if I missed something.
Yep, I will do that.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the role of early intervention in preventing language deprivation. So, hi, my name is Shelby Clark. I am a speech language pathologist for the Minot Infant Development Program. I started working with MIDP in 2019 and then joined the North Dakota Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Team in 2023. I hold the Certificate of Clinical Competence from the American Speech Language Hearing Association and maintain state speech language pathology licensure in North Dakota, Missouri, and Wisconsin. I also completed the Utah Regional Leadership and Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities program in 2023 and have extra training in pediatric feeding disorders and sensory processing. When I'm not working, I like to hang out with my dog Sarge, spend time with my friends and family, read, and do puzzles. Very exciting. Okay, so here are objectives for today. Define language deprivation and the critical window for language acquisition in children who are deaf or hard of hearing. Explore evidence-based bilingual bimodal approaches to support robust communication skills, and then navigate the balance between medical recommendations and family preferences to advocate for comprehensive language access. So to start us off, I have a question. What do you think are the main reasons deaf and hard of hearing children might struggle to learn and use language? Let's see if I can. Never hearing it. Oh, here we go. Yep, that's a good one, Audrey. Never hearing it. Hearing with distortions. Yep, our environment is so auditory. Yep. Yeah, so there's a ton. Let's get back to my notes. So for example, delayed identification and intervention. So let's say timely identification of hearing loss is crucial. So, delays can result in maybe not getting that hearing loss identified quickly enough. So we really want those hearing losses to be identified so that there are no delays in providing interventions. So whether that be hearing aids or cochlear implants or access to sign language, we really want to be able to give these kids that access to language. Another reason might be parental misinformation and limited support. So many parents of deaf children, particularly hearing parents, since over 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents, receive conflicting advice about communication methods. So for example, parents are sometimes discouraged from using sign language despite evidence showing its benefits and no harm to speech development. Another reason could be lack of access to resources. Families often face difficulties accessing necessary resources due to, financial, logistical, environmental, or any kind of other barriers. This can include challenges in obtaining appropriate hearing technology or sign language education. A lack of multidisciplinary collaboration might be another reason. Having access to language requires coordinated care between audiologists, speech language pathologists, educators, early intervention professionals, but gaps in communication between these providers and between the providers and the families can lead to inconsistent or incomplete support. And then cultural and social stigma. So stigma around hearing loss and the use of sign language can discourage families from pursuing certain communication strategies. So language deprivation, what is it? It's a lack of a fully accessible language during a child's critical language period. So fully accessible language means that the child can fully understand and use the language in some way in their everyday environment. Language deprivation occurs when a child does not receive consistent and meaningful exposure to spoken or sign language input during that language period. If a child isn't consistently exposed to a natural language, whether it's spoken, signed, or a combination, their brain may not develop the necessary neural pathways that they need for fluent language use. It's known as a phenomenon so rare among hearing children that it's seldom seen outside famous cases of severe developmental pathology or criminal abuse and neglect, and yet so common among deaf and hard of hearing children and adults that it often fails to provoke the alarm it deserves. And really, when you think about it, hearing babies begin acquiring language even before birth by perceiving sounds and words in the womb. While on the other hand, babies born deaf or hard of hearing miss out on that early exposure, which already puts them at a disadvantage in terms of language acquisition and listening age. So some of the consequences of language deprivation, there's a lot, but I'm going to mostly focus on the cognitive, social, and academic. So cognitive, executive functioning difficulties. So children who experience language deprivation may show deficits in working memory, planning, cognitive flexibility, because language really acts as a tool for organizing and structuring our thought processes. Decreased neural connectivity. So early language exposure kind of shapes the brain's neural networks. So deprivation during the critical language period reduces synaptic density and connectivity. And then also impaired symbolic thinking. So a lack of exposure to language during the critical language period can hinder the brain's ability to conceptualize ideas, participate in more of that symbolic thinking that will eventually lead to lifelong challenges in reasoning and problem solving. Social impacts, difficulty with emotional expression. So language is a primary tool for expressing expressing emotions and understanding social cues. So children without that early language access may struggle to communicate their feelings or struggle to interpret other children's emotions. They may experience weakened attachment and relationships. The absence of that shared communication limits a child's ability to bond with their caregivers or bond with their peers. So that secure attachment often relies on those reciprocal or back and forth interactions with other people in their environment. And then social integration challenges. So deficits in language skills can lead to misunderstandings, misinterpretations, etc. in social settings, which would obviously make it harder for children to form and maintain relationships. And I do want to note that all of these consequences, although we're talking about in the terms of deaf and hard of hearing children, can also be applied to hearing children who aren't getting, necessary language input as well. But then also going on to academic impacts, impaired literacy development. So research shows that children who lack early language exposure often struggle with phonemic awareness, decoding, some of those foundational elements of literacy. So obviously we're going to have some literacy impacts. Achievement gaps. So academic performance often depends on one's proficiency in their language. So it affects, understanding of math problems, understanding of science concepts, and having the ability to understand historical texts. And then reduced access to higher education. So long-term deficits in language skills can reduce opportunities for higher education and employment, as academic success really builds on a lot of the early linguistic foundations that we work on. So it's hugely important to act during the critical language period to enhance a child's outcomes. Okay, so the critical language period. It's a specific time period in early childhood, generally from birth to around 5 years of age, when the brain is highly adaptable and optimally primed to learn language. Some of the key characteristics of why this period is so important include neuroplasticity. So during this period, the critical language period, the brain's neural circuits are especially receptive to forming the pathways necessary for language processing. So without the input to kind of create these neural circuits, they're not going to develop fully. Irreversibility. So if language exposure is significantly delayed or absent during the critical language period, it becomes much harder and sometimes impossible to fully acquire language skills later in life. So while some language learning is possible after the window, it's often incomplete or impaired. And then modality. So some have mistakenly believed that the critical language period applies only to spoken language. However, it applies to all forms of language, whether it's spoken, signed, written, etc. Okay, moving on to comparing language acquisition trajectories between hearing children and deaf or hard of hearing children. So, excuse me. Typically, in hearing children, spoken language is acquired naturally through consistent auditory input during the critical language period. Is that always the case? No, but for the most part, that's typically how it works. Language milestones progress in a predictable sequence. Again, is that always how it works? No, but for the most part, for hearing children, this is how language develops. And then auditory input allows for phonemic awareness, vocabulary growth, and grammar to develop pretty easily. And going to deaf and hard of hearing children, for those who have early access to language, they can develop language milestones similarly to their hearing peers. However, without that access to early access to language, they can develop delays in vocabulary, syntax, phonology, and you generally see more broad deficits in literacy, social, communication, and cognitive skills. So some of the key differences between language acquisition in a hearing child and language acquisition in a deaf and hard of hearing child. Hearing children typically acquire language incidentally through passive exposure. However, deaf and hard of hearing children require more of that deliberate and structured intervention to achieve similar outcomes. So the big question, how do we prevent language deprivation in children who are deaf or hard of hearing? I really like this quote by Hall. It says developmental approaches for deaf children should prioritize healthy, expected development of all developmental domains, so cognitive, academic, social, emotional, that come with the acquisition of a fully accessible first language foundation. So I really want to emphasize the foundational role of language in kind of obtaining those holistic developmental outcomes for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. Developmental domains such as cognition and social emotional skills rely on the ability to communicate and interact with the environment. So for children who are deaf or hard of hearing, these developmental domains, they're not inherently delayed, but they can be compromised without proper access to language. So, and when you think about it, when you evaluate a child with language delays, a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time you'll see delays on the cognitive and social emotional subtests as well, because those domains rely a lot on language and communication. So even though, the child may only have language delays, those language delays will be present in a lot of different domains. Research shows that early language exposure, particularly during the critical language period, ensures that children achieve age-appropriate milestones across all domains. Delays in acquiring a first language often lead to cascading effects, such as challenges in cognitive processing, social interaction, and academic success. All that to say, language should be treated as a tool to unlock a deaf or hard of hearing child's full potential across all areas of life, not just pinpointed in language. Without the age appropriate skills in a first language, those early language delays may set the stage for further language, cognitive, and social delays. So now we'll go into some of the more popular interventions and approaches that are offered to families of children with a hearing loss. So assistive technology devices, excuse me. Assistive technology is often the go-to when a child is diagnosed with hearing loss. And these devices can include hearing aids, which amplify residual hearing for those with mild to moderate hearing loss. And for children with profound hearing loss, cochlear implants can provide auditory input when paired with early intervention. So current practices in the field are typically heavily influenced by the medical model of disability, which focuses on fixing the disability in order to allow deaf children to assimilate into the hearing world to the fullest extent possible. But just know that the success of these devices depends on many factors, including the age of implantation, access to therapy, and family engagement. And something that's not always made clear to parents is that the level of access to spoken language that deaf and hard of hearing children get from hearing technology really varies. The quality of sound is not usually able to be determined until the child is able to respond using spoken language, at which point their language could have already become severely delayed. So let's go through some pros and cons of assistive technology devices. Pros would be obviously better access to auditory information. So devices like hearing aids and cochlear implants can enable many children to access sounds they would not otherwise hear, which can support the development of spoken language when paired with appropriate therapy. And then also more participation in the hearing community. So these technologies can help children integrate into mainstream educational settings and social environments by facilitating communication with their hearing peers. And some cons would be accessibility and affordability. Devices like cochlear implants and advanced hearing aids are expensive, and not all families have access to financial assistance or insurance coverage to afford them. Plus, costs for repairs, maintenance, and batteries can add up over time. Not all children achieve optimal benefits from assistive technology, so the effectiveness is not consistent across the board with every child. Factors like the degree of hearing loss, the age at intervention, the consistency of use, and if there are other disabilities present, can impact the effectiveness. Cochlear implants, for instance, they don't restore normal hearing, but they provide a representation of sound that requires extensive auditory rehabilitation. And then cultural considerations. So some of the deaf community view relying on assistive technology as a focus on fixing deafness, which can conflict with cultural identities that value deafness as a difference and not a disability. Any questions so far? I feel like I'm going pretty quickly, and I don't mean to. I don't see anything in the chat. Okay, moving on to bilingual bimodal approaches, which is another intervention. So bilingual bimodal language, the bilingual bimodal language approach is a method of language acquisition that combines the use of two languages from two different modalities. So a spoken language like English and a visual language like American Sign Language. So there's the bilingual aspect, which is, learning two languages, and then the bimodal aspect, which is using two different modalities of language. And then go ahead. And then within bimodal, we've got the auditory oral modality, which is spoken language, which involves hearing, so the auditory part, and speech production, which is the oral, and the visual manual, which is, relying on the hand movements, the facial expressions, and the body language. So overall, the bilingual bimodal approach. So an environment that allows for deaf children to become bimodal bilinguals is effective in avoiding language deprivation and supports the development of a healthy deaf identity, a home cultural identity, and situates the deaf child comfortably between both the deaf and the hearing worlds. So let's go into some pros and cons of the bilingual bimodal approach. So the pros include it supports cognitive development. Bilingualism enhances cognitive skills such as problem solving, attention, control, and flexibility in thinking. And then bimodal bilinguals show unique advantages in multitasking and processing because they use two different modalities. And I like to compare it to, you know, when we're learning something new, if we're learning it, if we're hearing it, so auditorily, but then we're also manipulating something with our hands, which is, tactile, that's two different modalities where we're learning this information. We're probably learning that information a lot better with the two different modalities than just the maybe one. Stronger language foundations. So children who are exposed to a visual language like American Sign Language alongside a spoken language often have a stronger first language, which having a strong first language supports literacy and academic development in the second language. It nurtures identity. It allows children to interact effectively with both deaf and hearing communities, which fosters that sense of belonging and reduces some of that social isolation that we tend to see. And it also reduces the effects of technology gaps. So even if assistive devices like hearing aids or cochlear implants fail, children with access to sign language still will have a fully accessible language system. And then some of the cons include proficiency of language models. So a lot of times when children are born deaf or with a hearing loss to hearing parents, families and caregivers may feel the need to learn sign language themselves, which obviously requires time, dedication, and access to resources. And it takes time to become proficient in sign language. And the time period in which the parents are learning coincides with the critical language period. So there can be kind of that practical concern. Parental and professional resistance. Families and practitioners may fear that learning sign language will interfere with spoken language development, but research shows this concern is unfounded. And often many parents are advised to pursue a monolingual spoken language approach initially, with the reassurance that their deaf or hard of hearing child can learn sign language later on if it turns out to be desirable. However, that approach ignores the consequences for lacking the early accessible language input. And the view that sign language can be learned later really overlooks kind of that well-documented critical period of language acquisition. And then inconsistent exposure. So for optimal results, obviously children need consistent exposure to both languages, which can be challenging if families or communities lack resources for bilingual or bimodal education. So here are some of the big factors that kind of influence bilingual bimodal language development. The timing of the initial sign language exposure. So some hearing parents opt to learn to sign, but like I said, it takes time before they're able to provide fluent sign language input. While the number of other signers that the child might be exposed to, whether it's through like an early intervention program or a deaf mentor, can vary greatly. So if parents are still learning to sign during that critical language period, we're not getting the amounts of input that we're getting, and maybe the quality isn't that great, which kind of goes into the next factor, which is the quantity and quality of language input. But it has been found that parents with even a moderate proficiency in sign language have a positive impact on the child's language development when used consistently. The manner in which the input is divided is also important. This can be something like mom only uses spoken language while dad only uses sign language, or parents use spoken language and sign language at home while daycare uses only spoken language. It kind of just depends. However it's divided is an important factor. Exposure to each language, with more exposure leading to higher proficiency. And also the number of people who use each language is also important. Societal attitudes on bilingualism, that's a big one. Learning spoken English has long been valued above all other types of education. So that can be a big factor in, parents deciding on if a bilingual bimodal approach is right for them. And then also parent attitudes on deafness and sign language. This can really affect the amount of exposure the child receives to each language, whether it be spoken language or sign language. The age of overall language exposure, obviously the earlier the age of language exposure, it generally leads to higher proficiency in that language. And then we've got the sound quality of cochlear implants. So like I said earlier, it's not the same as what a hearing person might hear. So the sound quality is different from the sounds perceived by hearing children. Okay, so all of that to say, what do we do? Here are some of the biggest, kind of most popular recommendations to use with families of children who are deaf or hard of hearing. So one of the first things is determine if a deaf or hard of hearing child is at risk for language deprivation beyond being deaf or hard of hearing. So being deaf or hard of hearing isn't always the sole factor that determines whether a child's at risk for language deprivation. Other factors could be, do they have access to language input? Are there additional developmental or cognitive delays? Are there any environmental factors or social factors like socioeconomic status, family dynamics, access to resources, etc.? And then how much does the family know about, hearing loss, language acquisition? That's really going to determine, I don't want to say the intensity, but like kind of the intensity of the intervention that you're going to suggest. We want to set and monitor language goals and care plans for deaf and hard of hearing children, noting that language milestones can be met in any language. So by setting and monitoring these goals, you can ensure that these children have the opportunity to develop that strong first language foundation, which is, like I said before, critical for overall cognitive, social, and academic development. Be prepared to support acquisition of a signed language. This means being proficient in a sign language used in your region and having the expertise to support sign language acquisition and or referring families to professionals who can. Obviously, this is one that's not always feasible, but as much as possible, we want to expose the family and the child to sign language, to different modes of communication. Seek guidance from deaf and hard of hearing people. So we always want to get the perspective of someone who has that lived experience using any of the communication modes that you're recommending to families, and then incorporating those perspectives into our practice. And deaf mentors are incredible resources. It's essential for us to provide information and guidance to parents to help them make those fully informed decisions, and to not accept parents' preferences at face value when their preferences might put their child at risk of language deprivation. So when a family expresses a preference that their child learns to hear and speak only, ask some open-ended questions that probe their underlying motivations. These could be questions like, what does success look like for your child in terms of communication and language? Can you share more about your family's daily communication needs and how you see your child participating? What are your thoughts about how your child might connect with other deaf or hard of hearing individuals or communities? Do you have concerns about incorporating other forms of communication, such as sign language? Have you considered how using multiple modes of communication could support your child's overall development? How do you see your child communicating with different people in their life, like family, friends, or teachers? And then a question that I really like for parents to ask themselves is this choice going to best position my child to develop a strong foundation in at least one language? We want to know the difference between unfounded arguments against sign language and practical barriers to support sign language acquisition. So we want to be able to determine the extent to which the parents' preferences are being driven by unfounded arguments, practical concerns, misconceptions about what sign language is, social biases, or any other factors. We want to be familiar with local and federal resources that are available. Local resources could include state ID programs, early intervention programs, Hands and Voices chapters, schools for the deaf, etc. Federal resources could include the National Center for Hearing Assessment and Management, or NCHAM, which offers resources for families, including information on early hearing loss detection, communication development, and navigating systems like IDEA. Oh, excuse me. And then the Family Leadership in Language and Learning, or the FL3 Center, assists parents in finding peer support and understanding their options for raising a deaf or hard of hearing child. Discuss the importance of ensuring mastery of at least one language. Mastering at least one language enables children to process, analyze, and interpret the world around them, which fosters attachment between children and their caregivers, allows them to express their needs, emotions, and thoughts, and lays the groundwork for literacy, which is necessary for all areas of formal education. We want to explain to families that the critical language period applies to spoken and signed language. And we want to provide families with high quality information to support their decision making. And some final thoughts. Parents and professionals should be aware that the cochlear implant is currently unreliable as a standalone first language intervention. I just want to kind of highlight that as a standalone first language intervention. Cochlear implants are great. We just want children to be successful and have access to language even before the cochlear implants are activated. Because a lot of times the results of having cochlear implants are variable, as the success of them depends on many factors. Relying solely on cochlear implants may delay exposure to language during the critical language period if we're not, exposing them to sign language before the implant is activated. And the results are dependent on consistent auditory access and therapy after they have been activated, which may not always be feasible for families, due to economic, logistical, or other systemic barriers. Recommending sign language only as a last resort risks language deprivation, as that critical language acquisition window applies to all modalities. Recommending sign language as a last resort assumes that spoken language will develop successfully without additional support. However, the critical period for language acquisition is time sensitive and applies to both auditory and visual modalities. So delaying the introduction of sign language risks leaving a child without that fully accessible language during that window. Using sign language early alongside spoken language ensures children have immediate access to a robust communication system, reducing the risk of language deprivation and its long-term impacts. Mastering a first language early is vital for communication and development. Deaf and hard of hearing children may not achieve this if exposed only to spoken language. Research shows that without a fully accessible language, deaf and hard of hearing children risk delayed language milestones, which can have those cascading effects on their ability to learn, form relationships, and regulate emotions. So incorporating sign language, even when pursuing those spoken language goals, is an evidence-based strategy to prevent language deprivation and its associated challenges. And this is probably one of my favorite quotes. The either or dichotomy of spoken and sign languages need not and should not exist. The idea that families and professionals must choose between spoken and sign language creates unnecessary tension and limits the opportunities for deaf and hard of hearing children to develop robust language skills. Instead, both modalities can and should exist in a complementary way. Spoken language and sign language are not mutually exclusive. They serve different but equally valuable roles in supporting a child's language acquisition. And then providing families with early information about bimodal bilingualism can ease fears about communication and cultural connection, which empowers deaf and hard of hearing children to shape their own communication choices. This reassurance can ease parental concerns and foster confidence in their ability to support their child's development. And it can also give the children the flexibility to shape their own communication preferences as they grow, whether that means relying more on spoken language or more on sign language or a combination of both. By providing this foundation, families can support their child's development while honoring their individuality and autonomy, which, is kind of the biggest goal. We want that goal for all of the children that we work with. Okay, any questions? I feel like I ran through that really fast, so please let me know.
So again, you can either put your questions in chat or just come off mute and ask your questions. We'll leave 2 minutes for Shelby to answer anything that you had.
I was just going to mention too, when we were at the Eddie conference last spring, they one of the sessions that we were in, they were reviewing some research that showed a pretty strong correlation between the early intervention exposure to language, support for language development for children who are deaf and hard of hearing or hard of hearing, and their third grade reading proficiency. So just, even looking forward to their years in the educational system, how important that early exposure to language is for them.
Oh, great.
Yes, I think we were at that one together, Rebecca.
Yeah, I'm gonna speak for Audrey and I. We have been exposed to systems that basically say the child should be all oral when signing was definitely dissuaded. But I think overall, parents are influenced by the first person they talk to. And I think if they don't understand what their child can hear and the future that's out there for their child, they might often go down a road that's detrimental for the child. I've seen families that will accept only signing and families that will accept only oral. And I think
Which,
the bimodal, approach is successful, and it should be espoused by all of us who are in early intervention.
and you bring up a good point, because parents they want to know that their child is going to be successful later on in life. So that's why bringing in a deaf mentor, or bringing in someone an adult or an adult you can somehow gain access to, who is deaf, for parents to see, like, this person is a deaf adult, and they're a fully functioning professional, like working and having a fully accessible life. So I think, yeah, that was a really great point.
And then there is a question about resources for Spanish speaking families.
No, we could always use more resources for Spanish speaking families. I don't have any on hand, but I will look for some, and if I find some, I'll send them your way, Ellie.
Shelby, I love that you touched on the cultural aspect of deafness, because that's so important to the deaf community. A lot of them are very proud of being deaf, and they don't see it as a disability.
Right.
In a perfect world, of course, these children would be able to live with their families, go to a deaf school. Their families would all learn sign language. Maybe they would get a cochlear implant and be able to hear a little bit, but we know that's not available to everybody. But I love that you do recognize the cultural aspect of that.
And it's so important.
It is. It's very important. And it's a huge part of a lot of these individuals' identity. A lot of them, as they grow up, prefer sign language. And a lot of them choose to not use their cochlear implants.
Right.
And it's nice when they can have the support from their families that will choose to learn to sign with them and join their world and support their world.
Yes.
So I appreciate that you touched on that. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to say one more thing, because I've got plenty of stuff to say, as Janelle is always acting. But I have had the opportunity to work with the baby of adults who are hearing impaired. And I think it's really, really important that there are resources out there. So I use an iPad, which will sign, because I'm working on breastfeeding with the baby, if the mom does not have a signer there. And that interface with the hearing and deaf world, it's gotten narrower. It's been enhanced by technology that's out there. And I think for that individual who is deaf or hearing impaired to embrace all of the technologies makes it easier for those of us that are just hearing. And it makes it easier for us to interface with them. So, because I have something to offer as a therapist, I want to download that on that family. And I don't want the blockage to be, I can't communicate. So
Technology is both a blessing and a curse. So
yes,
on all things. Well, great. I am going to, Rebecca and I have been chatting in the background, and so we're hoping that Nicole is on the call as the other Rebecca Foster. Is that true? Did I see her?
I'm here.
Okay.
Oh, I am as the other Rebecca.
Okay.
Sorry. I thought I had seen me pop up, but then I didn't realize I didn't have my own name.
Okay. We were like, I think that's her, but I don't know. Okay, so go ahead. Did you want me to share your slides, or are you going to share yours?
You can share them if
Okay.
that's okay. I just wanted to piggyback off all the wonderful information that Shelby shared as well. And just to clarify, so I'm Nicole Sportout, and I am the Parent Infant Program and School Age Outreach for the North Dakota School for the Deaf here in North Dakota. I'm the coordinator for our program, and we work closely with Rebecca and their intervention program, and Shelby, and then our early hearing detection and intervention program in the state of North Dakota. And I think there were some really great things that were brought up. I think terminology always and ever changing in the world of deaf education, just staying up on that. So knowing that when we're talking about bimodal, like in my world, when you first said it, Shelby, and I get it, like the modes, like I'm thinking bimodal is one implant and one hearing aid, because they have two different modes of accessing sound. And so when we're looking at the cultural perspective, we use that bi, so it's bicultural, bilingual, but I also get like that bimodal mentality of like, we're using two different modes of communication too. So
Yeah, and that was definitely coming from like that speechy background,
yeah,
not the audition. Yep.
yeah, that's great. You had some really, really wonderful points, and Pat had made some good points too. And I just wanted to touch on that a little bit about when you're using those access points, and when Shelby had talked about deaf mentors. So we have a little girl in our state, and we have plenty of different cases that we could share, right? And this is not the one I'm talking about today, but she had cochlear implant surgery prior to 12 months. She has had wonderful early intervention services through both our parent infant program and our Part C programming. And she's also had access and regular visits with a deaf mentor. Her parents did not know any sign when they started this journey with her. And so when their deaf mentor came into the home, they had no means of communicating back and forth, but they have very quickly figured that out. And now when he goes to their home, they are all like one entity now. And he walks in, and this little girl will take her implants off, and she will just get fluent with him. And when he's not there, and she's in that, she can code switch, right? So she's got both that truly access to a bye kind of system, and she's very, very successful. And so I think when we look at those things, that we really have the research to back up, giving them every opportunity to develop language. And like Shelby said, that L1, that first language, first things first, but then additionally, there's no downside to having these other languages. So Janelle, are you controlling the PowerPoint for me?
Yep, I am. So you tell me next and I'll move through it.
Okay, go ahead. I don't know how much because I was late getting on, so I don't know how much of the background, Shelby, if you covered this kind of stuff. Okay, so universal newborn hearing screening, if anyone is interested, we have this goal of 136 across the nation. And so we really want those kiddos to have that initial screen before 1 month. And if they've referred twice, that they are in with their diagnostic audiologist and knowing what that hearing loss is by 3 months of age, and then being enrolled in appropriate and high quality early intervention services by 6 months of age. And when we talk about that 6 months of age, I like to say too, that includes their audiologist. Like we want them to be with an appropriate audiologist that is comfortable and has fit babies and knows what those options are in counseling families and having those discussions. So when we talk about that language acquisition is occurring at birth or even before, I am part of a coordinators call nationally that provides these early intervention services. And we always talk about our kids that we get at birth, if they're referred at birth and they're getting the 136, they're still already behind, because in utero, you start hearing at 20 weeks, right? So if we really look at it that way, then we have a gap to close from the beginning. Much of the development, as we know, and we talk to families about, 80 to 90% of vocabulary can be attained in those early years through incidental learning. So it's not me talking to my infant right here, but it's me talking to dad and me talking to siblings, and hearing infants are picking that up all of the time. So if we don't identify the hearing loss as soon as possible, we can see that language deprivation begin very early. Next. So these are just some hearing loss statistics as far as the national incidence. And really, when you look at these numbers, we can see this even in our state of North Dakota. We birth, I think, around 10,000 babies a year in our state, and we can follow these numbers and incident levels pretty closely. Here in North Dakota, we are not a mandated universal newborn hearing screening, but we are screening 98% of our babies for the most part. And our biggest concern then is our loss to follow-up. And so it's really trying to get those nurses that are in the birthing centers that are doing those beginning first hearing screens, that get the refer and what they're saying, that verbiage of sharing that information for the parents, so that those parents know the importance of really getting back in and confirming that diagnosis if there is a concern. Before the universal newborn hearing screening was established, we weren't seeing kids diagnosed. And here is typically 2 to 3 years. I still see kids that aren't diagnosed till 2 to 3 years. I think before universal newborn hearing screening, we might have even been closer to 5 years of age for some of the kids that we were getting. So definitely we're making progress, but we need to keep going. Yeah, thank you. So the case study that we used today that we brought up, and this was kind of a last minute, as you were talking, Shelby, I was like, oh, I could have used that one, or I could have used that one. Like, I just have all these different ideas for kiddos. If we're talking about language deprivation, when I've seen it full blown, that's for a later teenage type of child, what that looks like. But this child right now is 5 years old. And so when he was born, there was maternal use of marijuana and meth. And he was born and tested positive for that himself. There were concerns for sepsis. So a lot of medical things already going on right at birth. So the newborn hearing screening was completed on him. We can find it now in our health network in the HIN that he was screened. That did go into the system we use in the state of North Dakota in Oz. He did refer, social services then got involved at that point. The baby was released to the mother at that time. Attempts were made for follow-up with the parent by the pediatrician and the audiologist. And of course, there was a hole that just, they fell through the cracks kind of thing. So yeah, you can go to the next one. Thank you. He was then put into foster care at 28 days of age, and his foster parents, now his adoptive parents, were told, they have shared that they were never informed about the refer for the hearing screening. Had they been told, they would have done something about it. So unfortunately, we see, there's all these little places where one little thing could go wrong. And for him, that birth history, and then going home with mom, and then social work coming in, and then foster care providers, all those different entities, and the information didn't follow that child. So they never did the follow-up. They did schedule not a sedated ABR for when he was 7 months. So when they got to the audiologist and he was not sleeping, they could not get the information or the diagnosis that they wanted. They did get some inaccurate information where parents believed that there was normal hearing at each year. So they recommended follow-up for him after 1 year of age due to some risk factors that he had. Well, when the family made the appointment for that, and they had to travel 2 hours to get to that appointment in our state where we've got rural families, as I know pockets are everywhere in most states that are like that, but because of North Dakota Medicaid and the family being supported in that way, they did not get a referral from their primary pediatrician prior to going and arriving for their audiological appointment. So they were turned away at that point. They couldn't get into the audiologist because they didn't have the referral, and Medicaid wouldn't allow it to go forward. This is very frustrating to the family. You can go to the next. So then they moved from that audiological clinic because they were upset to another audiological clinic in a different area, which again was another hour and a half, 2 hours from their home. But they did get some, they did get the refer to go on to diagnostics. So at this point, this kiddo is over 1.5 years, not quite 2, but almost. By the time he gets in our system in North Dakota and all the appropriate referrals go out, he was pushing 2 years of age. So then at that time, he got his diagnosis, he got his hearing aids, he got enrolled. But if you're familiar with the Part C system, when you're almost 2, we are already looking at transition at 3. So there's a lot of balls in the air for this kiddo going on, much that's trying to get the hearing aids on and make sure that he's getting appropriate intervention and auditory training and all of those types of things. So I feel it stressed the system. I feel it stressed the family a bit. They were frustrated with the outcomes, and really, I think they were hurt, you know, that they would have done more faster, quicker if they knew. Behaviors started to develop. You really saw that there wasn't this natural 2-year-old development because he had been deprived of language. He wasn't getting access. So the challenges that we saw with this family due to these types of things, the bonding to the hearing aids was very difficult. Keeping them on was quite the challenge when you have a toddler that age that you're just now introducing. Not only the feeling of what hearing aids are, but the sound that is coming through them for him. You know, if you haven't had that access before, it's not like, oh, yay, I can hear. You know, he was doing fine himself, I think, for most of what he wanted. You know, he could communicate in a way, but then you throw all that noise at him, and that was very frustrating for him. Concerns due to the lack of language were everything for him, really. His social, emotional, behavioral, learning, communication, all of those areas were impacted for him. And there was less one-on-one educational support that led to the family in those early 1.5 years, 2 years, when they didn't get that direct counseling. They just didn't understand what the impact of the hearing loss was. They didn't know what resources or where to turn to. They didn't know what expectations to have for him, and they couldn't advocate for. They are wonderful parents, and they are very strong advocates, were then and are now, but they didn't know what they should be advocating for because they just didn't know the terminology. But I am happy to say now at 5, he is in a very good educational program. He has been implanted. He has a wonderful pediatric audiologist. He is getting a good dose of, if we think bilingual, bicultural. He has a full-time everyday teacher of the deaf on his team. And so he is communicating both through spoken language. He goes to his audiologist and he just talks. And when he's at school, he can sign with his peers and his teachers. And so I think this shows this case specifically shows a nice combination of how it started and the challenges and where that could have gone. And it could have been a lot worse, but getting in there when they finally got everything going, and not again in the timely fashion that we would hope, but that it did work out in this case, and it is going. And I'm not saying he doesn't have any delays, because there's still gaps to close, but I highly anticipate that he, with the support of his parents and his educational system, he'll do really wonderful things. And I feel like I talked about that really fast too, so let me know if you have any questions.
Well, what we are going to do, and I will move you through the breakout groups. We're going to just go in and talk about this case. So talking about things that maybe our programs or programs that we know of could have done to support this family, what maybe are some resources that are available, and just kind of just have this open discussion about this case. So Rebecca and Shelby, your group is in one. Pat and Tony, you are in another one. And then Heather, you're in a breakout group by yourself. So just again, just discussing kind of thoughts around this kiddo, different scenarios, and then we'll come back together, and then we will move Nicole, aka Rebecca Foster, in through the different breakout groups. So you should have all seen your breakout groups, so go ahead and join them, and then